The day had been exhausting in the most mundane way possible. Work had dragged, the weather had been overcast, but not rainy enough to feel cozy, and by the time I stepped into the McDonald's, I wasn't really thinking about much at all. I was craving something easy and familiar, a cheeseburger, fries, maybe some nuggets if I was feeling indulgent. The door whooshed open with a soft hum, and the smell of fries immediately hit me, comforting and nostalgic. I wasn't alone. A couple of people stood in line ahead of me, on their phones or chatting softly. I glanced toward the counter, expecting to see the usual crew of tired but efficient workers in their uniforms. Instead, my eyes found him. Steve. I didn't know his name yet, of course, but his name badge gave me a clue, polished gold letters against the backdrop of his uniform. What struck me first wasn't the badge, though, it was him. He had this presence about him, the kind of easy charisma that drew your attention whether you wanted it to or not. His dark hair was just a little disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it absent-mindedly. His hazel eyes glimmered under the fluorescent lights, holding a mix of warmth and something sharper, like he was always on the verge of a joke or a secret. And then there was that smile. Not just a polite, customer service smile, but a real, playful curve of his lips that made my stomach flip before I even knew why. I tried not to stare. Really, I did. But then he looked up, and for a second, our eyes met. His grin widened, and suddenly I felt like I'd been caught in a moment I wasn't entirely prepared for. Next. His voice broke through the soft murmur of the restaurant, and I realized it was my turn. Steeling myself, I stepped forward, gripping my phone a little too tightly, my thoughts racing faster than they should have been for a simple fast food transaction. "Hey there," Steve said, his tone light and friendly, but with just a hint of something else, something almost teasing. "What can I get for you today?" A cheeseburger meal," I stammered, immediately annoyed at how nervous I sounded. "With fries and a Coke." "Classic," he said, his fingers tapping effortlessly on the screen. He looked back up at me, holding my gaze this time, and smiled. "You've got good taste." It wasn't an unusual thing to say, really, but the way he said it made my pulse quicken. His voice dropped slightly, like we were sharing a secret, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was flirting or if I was just imagining things. "Thanks," I muttered, feeling the flush creep up my neck. Steve leaned forward on the counter, his elbows resting casually as if we were old friends chatting rather than a cashier and a customer. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "I feel like I'd remember you." I blinked, caught off guard. Was he actually flirting? Could that be possible? "Yeah, I live nearby," I managed, trying to sound nonchalant. "Well," he said with a small smirk, "lucky me. I guess I'll be seeing you around more often." His tone was playful, but there was something about the way he said it that felt personal, like he meant it just for me. I didn't know how to respond, so I smiled awkwardly and moved aside to wait for my order. Even as he moved around behind the counter, taking other orders and passing off bags, I could feel his gaze flicking toward me. Each time, his eyes lingered just long enough to make me feel like we were sharing a private joke, even though no words were exchanged. When my bag was finally ready, Steve handed it to me himself. His fingers brushed mine, barely but enough to send a jolt through me. "Enjoy your meal," he said, his voice softer now, more sincere. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But don't be a stranger, all right?" I nodded, suddenly unsure of my ability to speak. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but then his voice stopped me again. "Hey." I turned back, clutching the bag like it was some kind of shield. Steve was leaning on the counter again, that same smirk tugging at his lips, but his eyes were serious, almost expectant. "I'm off at 10, he said, his voice lower this time, like the words were meant just for me. "Come by then if you're still hungry, or if you're not." For a moment, I just stood there, caught between disbelief and something else I couldn't quite name. He was bold, sure, but there was an ease to it, like he'd known all along that I'd say yes. And maybe I already had, even if I hadn't said the words out loud yet. I smiled, a small, uncertain curve of my lips, and nodded before turning and walking out the door. The cool evening air hit me like a shock, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The walk home felt longer than usual, my mind replaying every moment of that brief exchange. By the time I reached my door, I realized I hadn't even opened the bag yet. The cheeseburger inside wasn't the only thing on my mind. At 10 o'clock, I'd be back. The night air was crisp as I walked back to McDonald's, my heart pounding in a way that made me question why I was even doing this. The streets were quieter now, the faint hum of passing cars and the occasional chatter of late-night walkers, the only sounds breaking the stillness. By the time I reached the restaurant, the lights inside had dimmed slightly, casting the place in a warm, golden glow that felt oddly intimate. Steve was already waiting for me. He stood just outside the doors, leaning casually against the wall with his hands in his pockets. His uniform was slightly rumpled, his tie loosened just enough to make him look more relaxed, more approachable. When he saw me, a slow smile spread across his face, and for a moment, I forgot about the cold entirely. "You made it," he said, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. "Yeah," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "Come on in," he said, holding the door open for me. The inside of the restaurant felt completely different, without the usual hum of customers and clatter of trays. It was quiet, almost serene, with just the faint sound of a playlist I didn't recognize playing softly in the background. "I thought I'd do something a little special," Steve said, leading me to one of the booths. "You know, since you didn't get the full 5-star experience earlier." I raised an eyebrow, but before I could say anything, he disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he emerged with 2 trays balanced expertly in his hands. "Voila," he said, setting one in front of me with a flourish. "Your gourmet late-night meal." I looked down to find a neatly arranged cheeseburger, a perfectly golden pile of fries, and even a small sundae on the side. It was a McDonald's meal, sure, but the way he plated it, with the burger wrapped carefully and the fries in a little paper cup, made it feel thoughtful. "You went all out," I said, smiling as I unwrapped the burger. "Only the best for my favorite customer," he replied, sliding into the seat across from me. We ate mostly in silence at first, the kind that felt natural rather than awkward. Every now and then, Steve would glance up at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners as if he was amused by something I wasn't privy to. "So," he said after a while, leaning back in his seat and wiping his hands on a napkin, "tell me something about yourself." "Like what?" I asked, feeling a little self-conscious under his gaze. "Anything. Favorite movie, weirdest habit, secret talent," or he added with a smirk, "you could just sit there and let me guess." I laughed, shaking my head. "All right, my favorite movie is The Princess Bride." Steve grinned. Classic. Bonus points for good taste. "And what about you?" I asked, turning the question back on him. "Oh, you know the usual. McFlurries by day, crime-fighting vigilant by night," he said with a wink. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. Seriously. "All right, fine. Favorite movie? Pulp Fiction. Weirdest habit? I alphabetize my spice rack. Secret talent? I can juggle." Juggle. "Don't look so surprised," he said, reaching for a fry. "I've got layers." The conversation drifted from there, easy and light, until we both finished our meals. Steve leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and gave me a mischievous look. "Okay, your turn to share something weird." "I already told you." "No, I mean really weird," he said, cutting me off with a grin. "Like, do you have any strange quirks, or a secret crush on someone you shouldn't?" I felt my cheeks warm, but before I could respond, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Fine, I'll go first," he said. "You know what they say about McDonald's fries, right?" I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "They're basically love potions," he said, deadpan. "Guaranteed to make anyone fall for the person who buys them." I laughed, shaking my head. "That's the worst pickup line I've ever heard." "Hey, I don't make the rules," he said, throwing his hands up in mock innocence. "I just serve the fries." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that lingered, drawing out the warmth between us. As the laughter faded, a quiet moment settled between us, the kind that felt charged with something unspoken. Steve's gaze softened as he leaned just slightly closer, his usual playful demeanor giving way to something more earnest. "I have to admit," he said, his voice low and hesitant, "I've been thinking about this all evening." Before I could ask what he meant, he closed the small distance between us, his lips brushing mine gently. It wasn't hurried or presumptive. It was tentative, as if he was testing the waters, giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned in, meeting him halfway, the warmth of his touch sending a spark down my spine. When we pulled back, his cheeks were flushed, and he smiled in that shy yet confident way that made my chest tighten. "I hope that wasn't out of line," he murmured. "Not at all," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The kiss lingered in the air between us like an unspoken promise, something I carried with me as I reluctantly stood to leave. "I should probably head home," I said reluctantly, standing up and gathering my things. Steve stood too, walking me to the door. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice softer now. "Thanks for dinner," I replied, feeling a strange mix of nerves and contentment. As I stepped out into the cool night, I glanced back to see Steve still standing in the doorway, watching me with that same playful smile. "Don't be a stranger," he called out, and this time, the words felt like more than just a casual goodbye. I smiled back, my heart lighter than it had been all day. As I sat in my apartment the next day, I couldn't shake the memory of the night before. It was like a warm glow that lingered beneath my skin, curling around me and refusing to let go. The moments with Steve, the laughter, the easy conversation, and that unexpected kiss played over and over in my mind, each time more vivid than the last. I found myself absent-mindedly staring out the window, lost in thought. The dinner he prepared for me wasn't anything extravagant, but somehow it had felt like the most special meal I'd ever had. There was something about the way he'd set everything up, how he seemed to care about making it perfect. It wasn't just the food, it was the effort he put into creating a night that was just for us. I had never really thought about something as simple as McDonald's food being so meaningful, but Steve had a way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. The way he looked at me when we sat down together, it was like he was seeing me in a way I hadn't been seen before. I couldn't help but feel special under his gaze, like he was genuinely interested in me, not just as some random customer, but as someone he wanted to get to know. The whole evening had this softness to it, a kind of warmth that I wasn't used to. It felt real. I smiled, thinking back to how I'd felt sitting across from him, the warmth of the booth enveloping us, and the occasional silence that spoke louder than words. I'd never thought a night like that was possible in a place like McDonald's, of all places, but there I was, feeling more alive than I had in months. And then there was the kiss. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. I thought I was prepared for it, but when Steve had leaned in, his lips brushing mine so softly, I was caught off guard. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise, an unspoken connection that left me wanting more. The hesitation in his touch, the way he seemed to give me the choice to pull away, made me trust him in a way I hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. It was a kiss that left me breathless, with a rush of emotions that I couldn't quite explain. When we pulled back, I could see the slight flush on his cheeks, the same heat I felt rising in me. We hadn't said anything immediately, but we didn't need to. The silence that followed felt like a continuation of the kiss, a soft understanding between us. There was no need to rush, no need to fill the space with words. It was just us standing in the glow of something new. I thought about how easily I'd let myself fall into that moment, how everything seemed to make sense in that space between us. Steve's beauty was undeniable. There was an effortless charm about him, the way he carried himself, the way he smiled that made me feel like I was the only one who mattered in that moment. His confidence was subtle yet undeniable. There was something magnetic about him that drew me in. But more than his looks, it was his kindness that had left an impression. And yet, the way he made me feel in that kiss, that was something I didn't expect. It wasn't rushed or impulsive. It was slow, deliberate, and full of promise. It felt like a doorway opening to something more, something that neither of us was willing to define just yet, but something that was undeniably there. As I thought back to the moments leading up to the kiss, the way he smiled at me, the way we'd shared that dinner, the subtle glances that felt loaded with meaning, I felt a flutter in my chest. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was more than that. There was an emotional depth that I hadn't anticipated, something I wasn't sure I was ready for, but something I was definitely drawn to. I found myself thinking about the future. What would happen next? Would Steve want to see me again? Would this connection we'd shared deepen, or was it just a one-time thing? I didn't know the answers, but I knew I was already invested in finding out. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. The world seemed brighter, more filled with possibilities. The idea of Steve and I exploring whatever this was, whatever it could become, was something that filled me with anticipation. I glanced over at my phone, the screen glowing in the dim light of my room. I had his number now. I could reach out. I could take the next step. But for now, I sat there, letting the thoughts swirl around in my head, savoring the feeling of the night before, knowing that whatever came next, I was ready for it. The next afternoon, Steve texted me, asking if I wanted to go for a walk. It was a simple enough question, but I felt a flutter in my chest when I saw his name on my phone. Something about his messages always made me feel like there was more beneath the surface, something unspoken but undeniable. I didn't hesitate. Sure, I replied, already looking forward to spending time with him again. When we met up outside, the day felt perfect in a way that I couldn't quite describe. The sun was warm but not too hot, and the gentle breeze brushed against my skin, giving everything a kind of softness. We fell into an easy rhythm as we walked, the sounds of the city blending with our conversation. It felt so natural to be with him, like we were two pieces of a puzzle that fit together effortlessly. As we strolled through the park, talking about our favorite books, places we'd like to visit, and all sorts of random things, I noticed the way Steve looked at me. There was an intensity in his eyes, like he was truly listening to everything I said. It was the kind of attention that made me feel special, as though my words really mattered. He wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. He was engaged in the conversation, making me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered at that moment. After a while, he suggested we go to the nearby shopping center. "Come on, let's check out the stores. Who knows? Maybe we'll find something fun," he said, flashing me that mischievous grin that always made my heart skip a beat. I agreed, happy to follow his lead. We wandered through the aisles, picking up random things, laughing at the most ridiculous items. There was a playful energy between us, something carefree and genuine. It wasn't about buying things, but about enjoying each other's company and letting the world outside fall away. Every time Steve flashed me that smile, I felt a little bit more drawn to him. Eventually, I found myself in the fitting room, trying on a jacket that I wasn't sure I even needed. The lighting in the small space was soft, and the mirror reflected my thoughts back to me. I looked at myself for a moment, noticing how the jacket fit, but more than that, I was thinking about Steve. I couldn't help it. The way he made me laugh, the way he looked at me, the easy connection between us. It was all so new, and it felt so right. I could hear the faint hum of conversation from outside the fitting room, but my mind was elsewhere. I found myself lost in thoughts of the last few days, replaying moments in my head, especially the way he kissed me. The memory of his lips on mine lingered like a sweet secret, and I felt a rush of warmth in my chest. The way we'd shared that kiss was so natural, so perfect. It was like it was meant to happen. Just then, a soft knock came at the door, snapping me back to reality. "Hey, you decent in there?" Steve called, his voice light, but with a hint of playfulness. I couldn't help but laugh. Just a second. I called back, quickly adjusting the jacket and trying to shake the lingering feeling of that kiss from my mind. When I opened the door, there he was, standing right there, his eyes instantly finding mine. The moment felt charged, like the space between us had been filled with anticipation. I wasn't sure what had brought him here, but I could tell from the way he looked at me that he had no intention of leaving without saying something more. "Wow," he said, taking a step closer and his eyes running over me with that familiar intensity. "You look amazing." I felt my cheeks heat up at the compliment. My stomach fluttered with nerves, but there was something else there too, excitement. He wasn't just commenting on the jacket. He was looking at me as though he saw me in a way that no one else did. It was the kind of attention that made me feel both exposed and seen, and it sent a thrill through me. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Instead, I just smiled, suddenly feeling self-conscious in the best way possible. Steve stepped even closer, and I felt the air between us shift. His gaze didn't waver, and the playful, teasing tone in his voice melted into something quieter, more intimate. "You're stunning, you know that," he whispered, his voice dropping to a softer pitch that sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, he closed the space between us and leaned in. His lips brushed mine with the kind of gentle hesitation that made my heart race. It was like a question in the air, an invitation to something more. And without thinking, I kissed him back. It wasn't rushed, but it wasn't hesitant either. It was slow and deliberate, like we both had all the time in the world. His lips moved against mine with a softness that sent warmth through my body, and when I felt the pressure of his kiss deepen, I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a connection. A spark that had been building since the moment we met, and in that moment, it felt like everything was falling into place. My hands moved instinctively, reaching for him as if I couldn't get close enough, as if I wanted to melt into him completely. We pulled away after a moment, breathless, both of us standing there in the quiet of the fitting room, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. There was a brief silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like we were both trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of the intensity of what just happened. "I didn't expect that," I said softly, still feeling the warmth of his kiss lingering on my lips. Steve chuckled, his eyes soft with something that resembled fondness, or maybe even something more. "Neither did I," he said, his voice low and steady. "But it felt right, didn't it?" I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. "Yeah," I said, finally finding my words. "It definitely felt right." We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, both of us unsure of what the next step was, but knowing that whatever it was, it didn't matter. We were here now, in this moment, and that was all that mattered. The moment ahead, he starts to take away my t-shirt. The kisses starts to run down lower and lower. He stands on his knees and did what he did. It was hilarious. I took a moment to breathe and then left. That evening, I found myself heading toward Steve's place again, a mix of excitement and anticipation settling in my chest. Every step I took felt a little lighter, a little more eager. When I knocked on his door and he opened it, his smile was all I needed to feel completely at ease. It was the kind of smile that made me feel welcome, as though I was exactly where I was meant to be. Without saying much, I followed him inside, and I couldn't help but notice how everything about his place felt like home already, cozy, familiar, and just right. We went into the living room, where Steve had already set up for our movie night. The soft light from the TV flickered across the room, but it didn't matter. The moment I sat down next to him, everything else seemed to fade into the background. The movie was on, but my attention was entirely focused on Steve. The way the dim light caught the contours of his face, the way he was relaxed, yet still so incredibly handsome. It all made me feel more drawn to him than I ever expected. We didn't speak much at first, just letting the movie play, but I could feel the tension building between us, unspoken but undeniable. I glanced over at him, and our eyes met. Something shifted in that moment. The air between us felt electric, and before I could even think, he leaned toward me, his lips brushing against mine. At first, the kiss was soft, almost tentative, like we were both savoring the moment. But then it deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate, and everything else. Everything seemed to disappear. I wasn't thinking about the movie anymore, or anything else for that matter. It was just him and me, our lips moving together, a rhythm that felt natural and right. He pulled me closer, and I let him, my body melting into his as we shifted positions. He kissed me again, this time longer, deeper, and I could feel his heartbeat against mine, steady and strong. As we lay back on the bed, his hands gently caressed my skin, sending a shiver through me. His touch was both soft and electric, and I found myself getting lost in it, lost in him. There was no rush, no need to move fast. Everything felt right in that moment, like the world outside didn't exist. All that mattered was the way we fit together, the way our bodies moved in sync, the way every kiss seemed to draw us closer. The movie was forgotten, the clock didn't matter, and all I wanted was to stay in that moment, wrapped up in him. I could feel his breath against my skin, steady and warm. My hands traced the muscles on his back, feeling the heat of him under my fingertips. It wasn't about anything else but the closeness, the tenderness that we shared. Time seemed to stop, or maybe it just didn't matter anymore. There was only the kiss, the way our hearts seemed to race in time, and the undeniable connection between us that was impossible to ignore. I didn't want to pull away. I didn't want the moment to end. But for now, I was content to be exactly where I was with him.